The mahogany gavel struck the bench with a sound that echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. Judge Patricia Thornwood looked down at the papers before her with the kind of weariness that came from 30 years of watching marriages crumble into bitter legal battles. This divorce case had been particularly exhausting. For 6 months, she had listened to Christopher and Elena Hartfield tear apart what had once been 15 years of marriage, dividing everything from bank accounts to coffee makers with the precision of surgeons and the hostility of enemies at war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Christopher Hartfield sat at the plaintiff's table in a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His attorney, a sharp woman named Margaret Chen, had organized their documents into color-coded folders that screamed meticulous preparation. Christopher's jaw was set in that particular way that suggested he had already decided the outcome of today's proceedings. He was a man who had built his entire career on winning, and he had no intention of losing now, especially not to the woman he had once promised to love forever. At the defendant's table sat Elena Hartfield, though she had already returned to using her maiden name of Rossi in every context except these legal proceedings. She wore a simple navy dress that she had owned for years, and her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Next to her sat her court-appointed attorney, a young man fresh out of law school named David Park who looked like he was in over his head. Elena's hands were folded on the table in front of her, and she sat very still, as if by not moving she could somehow become invisible to the judgment and hostility radiating from across the aisle. The courtroom was nearly empty except for the essential parties. These final proceedings had been closed to the public at Christopher's request, which Elena had not fought. She had no desire for an audience to witness the final dismantling of her life. A court reporter sat in the corner, her fingers flying across her stenotype machine, recording every word for posterity. A bailiff stood by the door, his face professionally blank after years of seeing families destroy each other in the name of justice. Judge Thornwood adjusted her reading glasses and picked up the next item on the long list of disputed property. Most of it had been resolved through months of negotiation and mediation. The house would be sold and profits divided. The cars had been allocated. The furniture had been picked over like carrion. The retirement accounts had been split according to state law. But there were still a handful of items that both parties claimed held special significance, things that could not simply be assigned a monetary value and divided down the middle. The judge cleared her throat and read from her notes. We come now to item 73 on the disputed property list. One Steinway Model D concert grand piano, serial number dating its manufacture to 1972. Current appraised value of $48,000. She looked up at both tables. Mr. Hartfield, you are claiming sole ownership of this instrument. Please state your reasoning for the court. Christopher stood, smoothing his tie with the practiced gesture of a man who spent his life in courtrooms. Your Honor, the piano in question was purchased by my father, Robert Hartfield, in 1973. It has been in my family for over 50 years. My father was a concert pianist before his death 12 years ago, and that piano represents not just a monetary investment but a connection to his memory and legacy. Christopher's voice was steady and professional, the voice of a man who had argued hundreds of cases and knew exactly how to present facts for maximum impact. He continued. When my father passed, the piano was left to me as his only son. I have the will and documentation to prove this inheritance. For the past 12 years, that piano has sat in what was our home, yes, but it has always been understood to be mine. It was my father's, and now it is mine. It represents my family history, my connection to my father's art, and frankly, it is worth a considerable sum of money. I see no legal or moral grounds on which my ex-wife can claim ownership of something that was never hers to begin with. Judge Thornwood made a note and turned her attention to the other table. Mrs. Hartfield, you are contesting this claim. On what grounds? Elena stood slowly, and David Park stood with her, though he looked uncertain about how to proceed. Elena's voice was much quieter than Christopher's had been, but it carried clearly in the silent courtroom. Your Honor, I understand that the piano was inherited by Christopher from his father. I am not disputing the legal ownership as outlined in Robert Hartfield's will. However, I am asking the court to consider that during our 15-year marriage, that piano became more than just Christopher's property. It became part of our shared life. Christopher made a sound that might have been a laugh or a scoff. His attorney put a hand on his arm, but he shook it off and remained standing. Shared life? Your Honor, my ex-wife is a waitress. She works at a diner. She has no musical training, no appreciation for fine instruments, and no ability to even play the piano. This is purely a financial grab. She wants to sell it and take half the proceeds, which I find both insulting to my father's memory and legally baseless. Judge Thornwood held up her hand. Mr. Hartfield, you will have your turn to speak. Please sit down. Christopher sat, but his face was flushed with anger. The judge turned back to Elena. Continue, please. Elena took a breath, and for the first time since the proceedings began, there was a flicker of something other than resignation in her eyes. Your Honor, my ex-husband, is correct that I work as a waitress. I have worked at Rossie's Diner on 5th Street for the past 17 years. I started there when I was 20 years old, and I still work there now at 37. Christopher is also correct that I never received formal musical training. My family could not afford piano lessons or music school when I was growing up. She paused, and her hands tightened on the table edge. But what Christopher does not know, what he never bothered to learn in all our years together, is that I taught myself to play that piano. Every day for the past 10 years, while he was at his law firm building his career, I sat at that piano and taught myself to play. I used library books and free online videos. I practiced during my lunch breaks and late at night when Christopher was asleep. That piano stopped being just an inherited object to me. It became my teacher, my companion, and my voice. Christopher stood up again despite his attorney's attempts to pull him back down. This is ridiculous. Your Honor, I lived in that house. I would have heard her playing. This is clearly a fabrication designed to create an emotional appeal. Elena turned to look at Christopher directly for the first time. You were never home, Christopher. You left at 6 in the morning and came home at 10 at night. On weekends you played golf or worked from your home office with noise-canceling headphones. You stopped hearing me years before the divorce. Why would you start hearing me play piano? The courtroom fell silent. Even the court reporter's fingers paused for a moment. Judge Thornwood leaned back in her chair and studied both parties. After a long moment, she spoke. Mrs. Hartfield, are you claiming that you can play this piano? Not just a few simple songs, but well enough that it justifies your claim to joint ownership? Elena nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Christopher's attorney stood. Your Honor, this is clearly a last-minute ploy. We have been through months of mediation and depositions, and this claim of musical ability was never mentioned. If Mrs. Hartfield could play piano, surely she would have mentioned it before now. This appears to be an emotional manipulation tactic. David Park, Elena's attorney, finally found his voice. Your Honor, my client is not claiming joint ownership based on monetary investment. She is asking the court to recognize that the piano has become significant to her personally through years of dedication and self-education. She is not asking to sell it. She is asking to keep it. Keep it? Christopher's voice rose. On what grounds? She cannot possibly house a concert grand piano in whatever small apartment she can afford on a waitress's salary. This is absurd. The instrument requires climate control, proper humidity levels, and regular maintenance by professional technicians. She cannot provide for it. This is about spite, pure and simple. She wants to take it from me because she knows how much it means to me. Judge Thornwood held up both hands. Everyone will calm down and sit down. Now. The authority in her voice brought immediate compliance. She removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. In 30 years on the bench, she had seen every kind of property dispute imaginable, but there was something about this one that felt different. The piano clearly mattered to both of them, but for very different reasons. Mrs. Hartfield, the judge said slowly, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I am inclined to award the piano to Mr. Hartfield based on clear inheritance and his ability to properly maintain such a valuable instrument. However, I am curious about your claim. You say you taught yourself to play over 10 years? Yes, Your Honor. Elena's voice was steady now. And you say you play well? I play from my heart, Your Honor. I cannot say if that qualifies as well by professional standards. Christopher leaned over to his attorney and whispered something. Margaret Chen nodded and stood. Your Honor, we would like to propose a resolution to this matter. If Mrs. Hartfield truly believes she has some claim to this piano based on her alleged ability to play it, let her prove it. Let her demonstrate her skill right now, in this courtroom. When she cannot, we can move past this obvious delay tactic and finalize the divorce proceedings. Judge Thornwood raised an eyebrow. You want her to play? Here? Margaret Chen smiled. Your Honor, there is a piano in the courthouse. The old upright in the second-floor music room is used for the community outreach programs. It is hardly a Steinway, but it should be sufficient for Mrs. Hartfield to demonstrate whether she has any genuine musical ability or if this is, as we suspect, a fabrication. The judge turned to Elena. Mrs. Hartfield, would you be willing to play for the court? Elena's face had gone pale, but she nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Christopher shook his head and muttered something to his attorney that made her smile. This was going exactly as he had planned. He knew Elena had no real musical training. She had probably learned to peck out a few simple melodies, nothing more. Once she embarrassed herself trying to play in front of the judge, he would get his piano and this entire farce would be over. He would finally be free of this marriage and the constant reminder of how far he had fallen from the ambitious young lawyer who had thought marrying a sweet waitress would somehow keep him grounded and humble. Judge Thornwood called for a 30-minute recess. The bailiff was instructed to escort Elena and her attorney to the second-floor music room to allow her time to prepare. Christopher and his attorney remained in the courtroom, confident and relaxed. Margaret Chen pulled out her phone and began answering emails. Christopher sat back in his chair and folded his arms across his chest. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Elena walked beside David Park in silence. Her young attorney was nervous and kept adjusting his glasses. Mrs. Hartfield, I have to ask, can you really play? I mean, well enough that it might change the judge's mind? Elena did not answer immediately. They climbed the stairs to the second floor, and the bailiff led them to a small room at the end of the hallway. The music room was barely larger than a storage closet. It held an old upright piano that had been donated to the courthouse years ago, several folding chairs, and a music stand with sheet music scattered on the floor around it. The piano had seen better days. Its finish was scratched and dulled, and several of the keys were chipped. The bailiff stood by the door. You have 30 minutes. I'll come back to escort you to the courtroom when time is up. He left, closing the door behind him. David Park looked at the piano and then at Elena. Well? Elena walked slowly to the piano and sat down on the bench. She lifted the fallboard and looked at the keys. They were yellowed with age and some of them stuck slightly when she pressed them. The sound was tinny and thin, nothing like the rich tones of the Steinway she had taught herself on. But a piano was a piano, and her fingers knew what to do. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes. What are you going to play? David asked. Something true, Elena answered. She began to play, and the small room filled with music. 30 minutes later, the bailiff knocked on the door and opened it. Time's up. Let's go. Elena lifted her hands from the keys and stood. Her face was calm now, peaceful even. Whatever happened in the courtroom, she had made her decision. She had spent 10 years pouring her loneliness, her disappointment, her grief, and her hope into music. Today she would share that gift, and let the judge decide what it was worth. They walked back down to the courtroom in silence. When Elena entered, she saw that Judge Thornwood had returned to the bench. Christopher was exactly where she had left him, arms folded, a slight smirk on his face. He thought he had already won. In his mind, this was just a formality before he could take his father's piano home and finally close the door on this chapter of his life. Judge Thornwood looked at Elena. "Mrs. Hartfield, are you ready?" "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded. To the bailiff. "Bring in the piano." Christopher sat up straight. "What?" Judge Thornwood looked at him over her glasses. "Mr. Hartfield, you challenged your ex-wife to prove her ability to play. However, I am not interested in hearing her play on a substandard instrument. If we are going to determine whether she has a legitimate claim based on her relationship with this specific piano, she should play this specific piano. I have ordered it brought from your residence to this courtroom." Christopher's face went red. "Your Honor, that piano weighs nearly 1,000 pounds. It requires professional movers and climate-controlled transport. You cannot just move it around like furniture." Judge Thornwood's expression did not change. "Mr. Hartfield, I am well aware of how to properly transport a valuable instrument. I have arranged for the premier piano moving company in the city to collect it and bring it here. They are professionals and your piano will not be damaged. Unless you would like to drop your contest of Mrs. Hartfield's abilities?" Christopher looked at his attorney, who shook her head slightly. They had backed themselves into this corner, and now they had no choice but to see it through. "Fine," Christopher said tightly. It took nearly an hour for the piano to arrive. The movers were careful and experienced, and they had the Steinway position in the center of the courtroom with surprising speed. They adjusted the bench, checked the tuning, and then left. The massive instrument dominated the space, its polished black surface reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead. Elena stood and looked at the piano. It was like seeing an old friend after a long absence. For 10 years, she had sat at this bench and taught herself to speak in the language of music. She had played through her loneliness when Christopher worked late night after night. She had played through her sadness when she realized her marriage was dying. She had played through her fear when she finally asked for the divorce. This piano knew her secrets, her dreams, and her heartbreak. "Mrs. Hartfield," Judge Thornwood said gently, "whenever you are ready." Elena walked to the piano and sat down on the familiar bench. She adjusted her position automatically, her body remembering the exact angle and height. She lifted the fallboard and looked at the keys. They were perfectly clean and perfectly maintained, just as they always had been. Christopher had paid for regular tuning and maintenance, even though he never played it himself. He had maintained it as a monument to his father, but Elena had made it come alive. She placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. The courtroom was completely silent. Christopher leaned forward in his seat despite himself, curious what she would play. Judge Thornwood set down her pen and simply watched. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine. Elena began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, Number 2. It was one of the first pieces she had taught herself, one of the most beautiful and melancholy compositions ever written. The notes began soft and gentle, like a whispered confession. Her fingers moved across the keys with the confidence of long practice and deep feeling. The music filled the courtroom, transforming the sterile legal space into something else entirely. The melody was achingly beautiful, full of longing and sadness but also hope and strength. Elena played with her eyes closed, not needing to see the keys. Her fingers knew where to go. They had traveled this path hundreds of times. As the piece progressed, the music grew more complex and more passionate. Elena's hands moved faster, playing the ornamental runs and trills with precision and grace. She leaned into the emotional peaks and pulled back in the quiet moments, shaping the music with the kind of interpretive skill that came not from lessons but from genuine love of the art. Christopher's smirk had vanished. He sat frozen in his chair, watching his ex-wife play his father's piano with a skill he had never imagined she possessed. How had he not known? How had he lived with her for 15 years and never discovered this talent hidden in plain sight? He tried to remember if he had ever heard her play, and realized with a sick feeling that he could not. He had been too busy, too focused on his career, too wrapped up in his own ambitions to pay attention to what was happening in his own home. The music continued, building to its emotional climax before gradually softening again. Elena played the final phrases with such tenderness that several people in the courtroom found themselves holding their breath. When the last note faded into silence, no one moved. Elena kept her hands on the keys for a moment longer, then lifted them and opened her eyes. Judge Thornwood sat very still, her face unreadable. Margaret Chen had put down her phone and was staring at Elena with something like shock. David Park looked like he might cry. The bailiff by the door had forgotten his professional neutrality and was openly impressed. Christopher found his voice first. That was, he paused, searching for words. That was Chopin. My father used to play that piece. Elena turned on the bench to look at him. I know. I found his old sheet music in the study. That was the first piece I ever learned. I thought if I could play what your father played, maybe I could understand him better. Maybe I could understand you better. Christopher looked away, his jaw working. Judge Thornwood cleared her throat. Mrs. Hartfield, that was extraordinary. How many pieces have you learned? I have lost count, Your Honor. Dozens, maybe more. I started with simple songs and worked my way up to more difficult compositions. I taught myself to read music from library books. I watched free video tutorials online. Every day I practiced, sometimes for hours. The judge made a note. And Mr. Hartfield, you truly never heard her play? In all those years? Christopher shook his head slowly. I was never home. When I was home, I was working. He looked at Elena again, really looked at her for the first time in years. I never heard you play. Because you never listened, Elena said quietly. Not to the piano, and not to me. Judge Thornwood removed her glasses and set them on the bench. I am going to take a brief recess to consider what I have just witnessed. Everyone will remain in the courtroom. She stood and disappeared through the door to her chambers. The minutes ticked by in uncomfortable silence. Christopher kept looking at the piano and then at Elena, his mind working through implications he did not want to acknowledge. His attorney sat quietly, knowing there was nothing she could say that would help at this moment. David Park gave Elena an encouraging nod, but she was not looking at anyone. She sat at the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. After 20 minutes that felt like hours, Judge Thornwood returned to the bench. Everyone stood automatically until she gestured for them to sit. She shuffled some papers, then looked up at both parties. I have been a judge for a very long time. I have presided over countless divorce proceedings and property disputes. Most of the time, these cases are straightforward matters of law and division of assets. But occasionally, very occasionally, a case comes before me that requires something more than legal precedent. It requires judgment in the truest sense of the word. She paused and looked directly at Christopher. Mr. Hartfield, there is no question that the piano in question was legally inherited by you from your father. The will is clear, and Mrs. Hartfield does not dispute this fact. Under normal circumstances, I would award you sole possession of the instrument and we would move on. Christopher allowed himself a small smile, but Judge Thornwood held up her hand. However, these are not normal circumstances. What I have witnessed today suggests that while you may have legal ownership of this piano, you have abandoned any moral or practical claim to it. You have allowed this instrument, this gift from your father, to sit unused in your home while another person gave it life and purpose. Christopher's smile disappeared. Your Honor, with respect, my father left that piano to me. Not to her. Your father left you a piano, Judge Thornwood agreed. But what I saw today was not just a piano. What I saw was a woman who turned that instrument into something more through years of dedication and love. You maintained the piano as a memorial to your father. She transformed it into a living expression of art. But she is a waitress, Christopher protested. She cannot possibly maintain it properly. She cannot afford the upkeep. She probably does not even have room for it wherever she is living now. Judge Thornwood's eyes narrowed. Mr. Hartfield, you are one of the most successful divorce attorneys in this city. You have spent your entire career arguing that marriage is more than a financial contract, that there are emotional and personal investments that must be considered when dividing assets. It seems remarkably hypocritical for you to now argue that only money and status should determine who deserves to keep this piano. Christopher opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Thornwood cut him off. I am not finished. She looked down at her notes. Over the course of these proceedings, I have learned a great deal about both of you. Mr. Hartfield, you are financially successful, professionally accomplished, and by all accounts, respected in your field. But you work 70 to 80 hours per week. You have no hobbies. You have not played your father's piano once in the 12 years since you inherited it. It is, as Mrs. Hartfield suggested, a monument. A very expensive monument that you visit occasionally to remember someone you loved. She turned to Elena. Mrs. Hartfield, you work at a diner. You earn approximately $30,000 per year. You live in a small apartment. By conventional measures of success and stability, you have very little. But what you do have is an obvious and profound connection to music, a connection you developed through discipline and passion over many years. The judge set down her papers. This court must balance legal ownership with equitable considerations. Mr. Hartfield inherited the piano, yes. But Mrs. Hartfield has invested something equally valuable into it. She has invested time, effort, and genuine love. She has given that piano purpose. Christopher stood up. Your Honor, you cannot take away property that was legally left to me. This is not equitable. This is theft. Sit down, Mr. Hartfield. Judge Thornwood's voice was sharp. The judge waited until Christopher reluctantly sat before continuing. I am not taking anything away from you. I am giving you a choice. She looked at both of them. Here is my ruling. Mr. Hartfield, you will retain legal ownership of the piano. However, Mrs. Hartfield will be granted unlimited access to the instrument for a period of no less than 5 years. What does that mean? Christopher demanded. It means, the judge said calmly, that you must either allow Mrs. Hartfield to keep the piano at her residence, or you must provide a suitable location where she can play it whenever she wishes. If you choose to keep it in your possession, you must grant her reasonable access, which I define as no less than 4 hours per day, 7 days per week. That is insane, Christopher said. You are essentially giving her the piano. I am giving her what she earned, Judge Thornwood corrected. If you find these terms unacceptable, you have a third option. You may sell the piano and divide the proceeds equally. Given its appraised value of $48,000, you would each receive $24,000. Christopher looked at his attorney, who leaned over to whisper in his ear. After a moment, he shook his head. That piano is not for sale. It was my father's. Then you will comply with the access arrangement, Judge Thornwood said. I will have the terms drafted and included in the final divorce decree. You have 1 week to determine whether Mrs. Hartfield will take possession of the piano or whether you will provide access to it at your residence or another suitable location. Elena spoke for the first time since playing. Your Honor, I do not have room for a concert grand in my apartment. Judge Thornwood nodded. I assumed as much. Mr. Hartfield, it appears you will need to make arrangements for your ex-wife to have access to the piano. I suggest you work with your attorney to establish a schedule that is acceptable to both parties. If you cannot reach an agreement, I will establish one for you. The judge gathered her papers and stood. This matter is concluded. I will see you all back here in 1 week for the final signing of the divorce decree. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck again, and Judge Thornwood left the bench. Christopher sat in stunned silence. 4 hours per day, 7 days per week. It was essentially giving Elena possession without actually transferring ownership. His attorney put a hand on his arm. Christopher, we can appeal. This ruling is highly unusual. Christopher did not respond. He was looking at Elena, who had returned to the piano and was running her fingers lightly over the keys, not playing, just touching them like one might touch an old friend's hand in greeting. She looked more at peace than he had seen her in years. Margaret Chen tried again. "Christopher, did you hear me? We can appeal this. We can argue that the judge overstepped her authority." Christopher shook his head slowly. "No. Let it go." His attorney looked shocked. "But this was your father's piano. You fought so hard for it." "I fought for a thing," Christopher said quietly. "I fought for an object. But I never fought for what it could be." He stood and collected his briefcase. "Draft whatever paperwork we need to give Elena access. 4 hours per day, 7 days per week. Whatever she needs." Margaret Chen opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Again. She had been Christopher's attorney for 5 years, and she had never seen him concede anything. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." Christopher walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Elena was still at the piano, her head bowed, her fingers resting on the keys. He cleared his throat. "Elena." She looked up at him. "Yes? That was beautiful. What you played. It really was beautiful." Elena studied his face, looking for sarcasm or cruelty, but finding neither. "Thank you. My father would have loved it. He would have loved knowing someone was playing his piano the way you play it." Christopher hesitated, then added, "I am sorry I never heard you before today." Elena nodded slowly. "I am sorry you never asked to hear." Christopher had no response to that. He turned and left the courtroom, his attorney hurrying after him. David Park came over to Elena with a huge smile on his face. "Mrs. Hartfield, that was incredible. I have never seen anything like that in my entire career, which, admittedly, is only about 6 months long, but still. That was amazing." Elena smiled at his enthusiasm. "Thank you for believing in me, David. What are you going to do now? You have unlimited access to the piano, but you still need a place to actually keep it or play it." Elena looked at the Steinway, thinking. "I will figure something out. Maybe Christopher will let me come to the house to play. Maybe I can find a small studio to rent where it can be stored. I do not know yet, but I will find a way. This piano and I are not finished with each other." David Park gathered his papers and wished her well. The bailiff came over and told Elena she had a few more minutes with the piano before it would be moved back to Christopher's residence. Elena nodded and sat down at the bench one more time. Alone in the courtroom except for the bailiff standing quietly by the door, Elena placed her hands on the keys and played. She played a song she had written herself, one that had no name because she had never imagined anyone else would hear it. It was a song about loneliness and perseverance. It was a song about finding beauty in unexpected places. It was a song about surviving. The music filled the empty courtroom, and this time there was no one to judge it or evaluate its worth. Elena played for herself, for the piano, and for all the nights she had sat alone in a big empty house and let music be her only companion. She played until the movers arrived to take the piano away, and even then she let her fingers linger on the keys for one last moment before letting go. The week that followed was strange for both Christopher and Elena. They met once more in Judge Thornwood's chambers to finalize the divorce decree and work out the details of Elena's access to the piano. Christopher's attorney had prepared a schedule that would allow Elena to come to his house 4 hours every day to play. Christopher would not be present during those times, and Elena would use a key code to enter through a side door that led directly to the room where the piano was kept. It was a cold, practical arrangement that satisfied the legal requirements while ensuring they would have no contact. Elena agreed to the terms without argument. She did not want to see Christopher any more than he wanted to see her. Their marriage was over, and she was ready to move forward with her life. On the first day of the new arrangement, Elena arrived at the house that had once been her home at exactly 2 in the afternoon. She punched in the key code and entered through the side door. The room where the piano sat was a large sunroom that overlooked the garden. Christopher had chosen this room specifically for the piano because the natural light and temperature control were ideal for the instrument. Elena sat at the bench and simply looked at the piano for a long time. Then she began to play, and for 4 hours she lost herself in music. She played Chopin and Beethoven and Mozart. She played songs she had learned from old recordings and songs she had composed herself. She played until her agreed time was up, then quietly left the way she had come. This pattern repeated itself day after day. Elena came every afternoon when her shift at the diner ended. She played for 4 hours and then left. Christopher was never there. His attorney had arranged for him to work late every day so he would not be home when Elena arrived. It was easier for both of them this way. But one evening, 3 weeks into the arrangement, Christopher came home early. He had a headache and could not concentrate on his work. He let himself into the house through the front door and heard music coming from the sunroom. He stood in the hallway, listening. Elena was playing something he did not recognize, something wild and passionate and full of pain. The music surged and fell, dancing between joy and sorrow with dizzying speed. Christopher found himself walking toward the sound, drawn by the raw emotion in every note. He stopped in the doorway of the sunroom and watched Elena play. She was completely absorbed in the music, her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly as her hands flew across the keys. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, lighting her hair and casting long shadows across the floor. She looked, Christopher realized with a start, exactly as she had looked when they first met 15 years ago. Young and hopeful and beautiful. The song came to an end, and Elena opened her eyes. She saw Christopher standing in the doorway and froze. "I am sorry. I did not know you would be home. I can leave early today." "No," Christopher said quickly. "Please, finish your time. I was just passing through." Elena studied him for a moment, then turned back to the piano. She began to play something softer, a gentle melody that reminded Christopher of rain falling on a still lake. He stood in the doorway and listened, not quite able to make himself leave. When Elena's 4 hours were finally up, she stood and prepared to go. Christopher had disappeared at some point, and she assumed he had gone upstairs or to another part of the house. But when she reached the side door to leave, she found him waiting there. "Elena," he said. "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" Elena hesitated, then nodded. "All right." Christopher led her to the kitchen and offered her tea, which she declined. They sat across from each other at the kitchen island, the marble counter between them like a border or a barrier. "I have been thinking a lot since the court hearing," Christopher began. "About what the judge said. About what you played. About what I missed." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I never knew you could play like that. In 15 years of marriage, I never knew." "You never asked," Elena said simply. "I know. And that is my failure, not yours." Christopher looked down at his hands. "I was so focused on work, on success, on becoming a partner at the firm and making more money and winning more cases. I thought that was what mattered. I thought that was what would make us happy." "Did it make you happy?" Elena asked. Christopher was quiet for a long time. "No. It did not." He looked up at her. "Were you unhappy? All those years, were you unhappy?" Elena considered the question carefully. "I was lonely. You were gone all the time, and when you were home, you were not really present. I felt like I was living with a ghost. But I was not entirely unhappy, because I had the piano. I had the music. That kept me from falling apart completely." "I am sorry," Christopher said, and for the first time since the divorce began, he sounded like he meant it. "I am sorry I was not a better husband. I am sorry I never saw you." Elena reached across the counter and briefly touched his hand. "I am sorry too. I am sorry I never told you what I was feeling. I am sorry I let the silence grow so large between us that we could not find our way back to each other." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them thinking about the 15 years they had spent together and the thousands of small moments when they might have changed course but did not. Finally, Christopher spoke again. "Keep it." Elena looked at him in confusion. Keep what? The piano. Just keep it. I will have it moved to wherever you want. You can have full ownership. I do not want you to have to come here every day like you are visiting a museum. The piano should be yours. Elena shook her head. Christopher, that instrument belongs to your father's memory. I won't take it from you. But maybe we can share it differently. What if I teach piano lessons here? Children from my neighborhood who can't afford private instruction. Your father would have loved that. Christopher considered this, then smiled genuinely for the first time in months. He would have loved that very much. My father always believed music should be shared, not locked away. 3 months later, the sunroom filled with children's laughter every Saturday morning. Elena taught 12 students, ranging from 6 to 16 years old. Christopher often listened from his study, the sounds reminding him of his own childhood when his father had filled their home with music. One Saturday, he walked into the sunroom during a lesson. Elena was showing a young girl how to position her fingers for a difficult chord. Christopher waited until the lesson ended, then sat at the piano bench beside Elena. Could you teach me? He asked quietly. I never learned to play my father's piano. Maybe it's not too late. Elena smiled and placed his hands on the keys. It's never too late to find what you've been missing. They began with simple scales, Christopher stumbling through basic exercises while Elena patiently corrected his posture and hand position. Week after week, he improved slowly. The piano that had once been a silent monument became something alive again, connecting them through shared purpose rather than legal obligation. A year later, Christopher and Elena sat together at the piano, playing a simple duet. Their divorce was finalized. Their romantic relationship was over. But they had found something unexpected in its ending. They had found friendship, forgiveness, and a shared love of music that transcended their failed marriage. The piano no longer belonged to just one of them. It belonged to the children Elena taught, to the music they created together, and to the memory of Robert Hartfield, who had known all along that a piano was meant to be played, not preserved. Elena looked at Christopher as they finished the piece. Thank you for letting me keep playing. Christopher shook his head. Thank you for teaching me how to listen. The music continued, filling the sunroom with sound and second chances. Sometimes the most beautiful songs emerge not from perfect harmony, but from learning how to hear each other after years of silence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.